They called it the war that didn't exist, a conflict waged in mountains where maps ran out of names. In the 1960s, the Plain of Jars woke to engine drones no one admitted were there, and a thin country became the hinge of a larger struggle. Pilots in unmarked planes flew from high ridges scraped flat and called Lima sites. Case officers bargained for loyalty with rice, radios, and rifles. Hmong teenagers learned to drop rounds into mortar tubes and read the sky like a second language. On paper, Laos promised neutrality. In practice, it lay across the Ho Chi Minh Trail like a dam someone had forgotten to build. North Vietnamese trucks threaded the Annamites at night, hauling men and munitions south into a war with an official name. To slow that flow without widening the war beyond what speeches allowed, Washington looked for shadows. The CIA already had a footprint, advisors, airstrips, and a relationship with a Hmong officer named Vang Pao. From a base at Long Tieng, a valley few Americans could find on any map because it did not officially exist, General Vang Pao built an army from highland clans who had little love for the Pathet Lao and less for Hanoi. He fought like the country he knew, sudden, elastic, moving ridge to ridge. Air America, the not-quite airline that was and wasn't the CIA, lifted food, ammunition, and wounded men over jungles the road network could not connect. Prop planes bled effort into humid air. Helicopters beat paths to remote pads. The code names sounded harmless: Barrel Roll, Steel Tiger, Tiger Hound. Under them lay a rain of iron. From 1964 to 1973, U.S. aircraft flew hundreds of thousands of sorties over Laos. Day and night, in monsoon and in heat, you could bite. They dropped more tonnage there than the United States had dropped on Germany and Japan in the Second World War. The math was obscene and tidy. Cluster bombs that split into bomblets like red or yellow fruit. 750-pounders that folded stilt houses in a single blow. Villages learned to read the sky. A distant rumble might be weather. A rumble with teeth meant a flight turning toward you. Children ran for caves chosen by elders decades earlier. Monks bundled scriptures and led lines of people along paths known only to those born there. When the planes passed, men returned with shovels and bamboo stretchers. Sometimes they found only a hole where a house had been, a pot still hissing on a hearth that no longer had a room around it. On the Plain of Jars, ancient stone vessels, giant cylinders whose makers had been dust for 2 millennia, sat among craters like survivors of a different catastrophe. Soldiers took cover behind them and threaded between them at night. Dry season burned the grass to wire, tracers stitched orange lines between the shadows. Control changed hands so often that schoolchildren learned 2 anthems and watched 2 flags with equal caution. Secrecy lived in contortions of language. Pilots filed flight plans that named no country. Case officers wrote reports in coordinates, as if squares on a grid could replace villages. Journalists who tried to see were escorted to safe ridges and shown safe vistas where nothing of consequence was permitted to happen. Meanwhile, in places congressional committees would never say aloud, planes turned, rolled, and erased. Vang Pao's army grew and then grew tired. Hmong villages emptied as young men went to Long Tieng. When the base flourished, it felt like a frontier town. Dirt runway, corrugated roofs, a bar serving canned beer, a control tower looking over a world built from expedients. When it faltered, the valley felt like a hinge on a door that would not stop swinging. The Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese pushed west. When supplies thinned, Hmong units bled alone on fog-soaked ridges, while case officers summoned air that sometimes did not come. Across southern Laos, along the trail, the bombardment became ritual. Trucks hid under woven mats and bamboo trellises pinned with living vines. Drivers idled through whole days, while spotters counted patterns overhead. At night the convoys moved, a river of whispers and muffled gears, crossing streams on log bridges rebuilt between raids. The Americans adapted with acoustic sensors strung like beads along gullies, with Raven forward air controllers who flew low and slow and marked targets with smoke rockets and terse radio calls. Numbers pretend to explain. Ton is dropped, sorties flown, villages displaced, miles of trail disrupted. The ledger was always busy. The residue showed itself most plainly after 1973, when the last raids receded and Laos had to live with what the war had done. Farmers returned to fields and found a dangerous harvest underfoot. Unexploded ordnance lay in soil like seeds that never germinated but could still kill the hand that found them. Children learned to avoid bright spheres that looked like toys. Men who farmed before the war learned to farm around scars. In the end, the United States left, and the Pathet Lao did not. Long Tieng emptied in a rush that felt like a pulled plug. People ran for aircraft that could lift only a fraction of those who had staked their futures on friendship and interest. Many Hmong began a long migration, to camps in Thailand, then to California, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, places where the air smelled like nothing they had ever breathed, and yet where certain ridgelines could fool the heart a moment. Others stayed and learned the careful rhythms of a landscape seeded with metal. Years passed before officials said aloud what everyone beneath the flight paths already knew. Hearings were held, acronyms unboxed, numbers admitted into the record. Aid teams began the slow work of clearing bomblets with detectors and string, moving a few meters a day under a sun that had watched and offered no comment. The old secrecy remained, a habit of not quite meeting another's eye when talk turned to places that had officially never happened. If you walk the plain of jars now, guides point out where bombs shattered stone and where others spared it by a quirk of aim. Farmers show paddies that bend around old craters filled with lilies. In village museums, you see racks of spoons and stools hammered from aircraft aluminum, elegant and sad. Somewhere in the hills, an old runway still lives under scrub. A long scar grass cannot quite heal. Close your eyes, and you can hear, faintly, the steady drone of a transport, the abrupt snarl of a dive, the echo that follows like a held breath. The secret war in Laos was never secret to those who survived it. It hid in plain sight, in sounds and absences, in a country that learned to speak about disaster without names. It showed how modern states fight with deniable hands while insisting their sleeves are clean, and how the people pressed beneath those hands carry memory anyway. For Americans who flew or supplied or called the strikes, there were acts of courage and kindness that do not shrink because the policy that framed them did. For Laotians, the past is present tense each time a field is burned, each time a metal clink in the soil makes a heart pause. History's ledger is never neat, but it should be legible. On one side sit code names, flight hours, tonnage, and a denial that lasted almost as long as the bombing. On the other side sit the names of places, the shape of jars older than kingdoms, the scar of a runway that pretended it was not there, the steady patience of people who learned to live among iron that refused to sleep. Between them stands a lesson. Wars do not end when the last plane lands. They end when the ground is safe again, and sometimes that takes longer than anyone dares admit. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.